Well, welcome again to another edition of the Risk and Resilience Dialogues from University of New South Wales. Today we are very lucky to have Guy Richardson, who is the Business Continuity Coordinator at Icon Water, the provider of water and sewage systems for the ACT. So welcome to the Risk and Resilience Dialogues, Guy. How are you?
Great, Paul. Thank you very much. It's a great honour to be here.
Well, it's great that we've managed to get an icon of the essential services infrastructure systems in Australia, such as yourself working for Icon, forgive the pun. One of the critical issues for me is business continuity management and business continuity planning in essential services is a critical function within Australian society. And I'd like to ask you, how do you actually apply risk governance and resilience building approaches to your work?
Thanks, Paul. It's an excellent question. One of the things about utilities generally, and water utilities particularly, is where we can't have a disruption in many ways. Although you will have water mains burst from time to time, and you will have sewerage leaks from time to time. We operate under really strict customer service regulations in the ACT. So we have to be able to restore or respond to a sewage incident within 8 hours and a water disruption within 12. And in the case of the water disruption, that's provide an alternative means of supply. That in itself requires you to have very strong, resilient business continuity plans, because you've got to be able to provide the customers with that essential service within those timeframes, and obviously a lot shorter, much shorter, to allow the society to operate. And it's not just drinking water services and sewerage. It's a whole range of connected services that work with that. For example, buildings have air conditioning services, the firefighting sprinkler systems and so on, all of which won't work if you lose your water supply. One of the interesting discussions that people in the water sector often have with our customers, particularly our big customers, we'll ask them a question like, who has an emergency backup power supply? They almost always put their hand up and go, they've got a generator, or they've got a battery farm, or they've got a UPS. And then you ask the question, who's got a backup water supply? And you tend to get a bit of a pause, because it's in Australia, it's such a resilient service that people expect it to be there. And for that reason, we as an organisation have to have that capability. And underlying all that is an understanding of what are our service standards. What risks do we have to manage to ensure those service standards are met for the community? And then what business continuity plans do we have to have in place to allow us to respond to those events that are foreseeable as possible disruptions, and those black swan events that could disrupt a service for a long period of time, and how are we going to respond to that as an organisation? And that has to be integrated with our emergency management arrangements, our business continuity arrangements, and in the IT space, our disaster recovery management arrangements.
One of the issues that I've faced professionally in my past, looking at, say, airport security, is that many people think that there could be a breach of security from landside to airside that might cause the throughput of customers to get on their planes. But one of the issues we discovered was if there's a breakdown of the sewage system, if toilets aren't working within the airport, that's also a vulnerability that will cause a slowdown, or at least a stoppage of people moving from airside to landside. So, sewage and potable water are things that I think in Australia, as you say, people assume will always be there, and we've had a long history of being very effective in delivering those services. Guy, one of the recent issues that manifested in Australia is the Critical Infrastructure Act 2018 amendments came through late last year. And some of the elements of that amendment was the notion of positive security obligations, which, in addition to the manifold nuances in the existing Act up to that point. And one of the elements that came out of the obligation statements was the need to embed preparation, prevention, mitigation activities into business as usual elements within organisations, particularly the essential services, obviously. Isn't that what business continuity already does?
I would certainly argue that it does, Paul. Now, the federal government looking at the changes in the risk and threat environment is a perfectly reasonable thing for government to do. And in fact, I think you're seeing an increasingly informed government seeing a range of disruptions to critical infrastructure that could occur coming in, and that's the basis of the legislation and particularly the basis of the changes. Where it, from an organisational perspective, gets complicated is our water utility already operates in a really complicated regulatory environment. We have health and hygiene regulations for the supply of water and the treatment of sewage. We have strong environmental regulations about how we can collect our water, how we can operate, how we can then discharge sewage once it's been treated back into the environment. And in case of the ACT, for our downstream customers who are going to receive the output of our treatment plant. We've got strong dam safety legislation at state level, which talks about how we'll maintain the resilience, how we'll safely operate and run our major dams. Obviously, a collapse of a dam is in itself a major disaster. All of those frameworks operate now, and then over the top of that, the federal government is placing risk and resilience arrangements, in some ways providing a good justification for a business like ours to maintain risk and emergency management resilience arrangements, but business continuity. We've said to the government as we've been going through the SOCI rulemaking process, we already have a lot of this in place, and I think the challenge for the federal government is going to be, how do you regulate appropriately without duplicating that regulation? How do you provide enough assurance to the Australian population, to the Australian community, that their critical infrastructure services will be there, whilst not over-regulating and not getting everyone focused on a compliance approach? We have a shared background in aviation security, and one of the things I was conscious, being on the other side of the fence, metaphorically, was we didn't want the government telling the airlines and the airports how to do their security. You want to set a standard that allowed them to compete on an equal playing field with each other, to put in place those security regimes so that you had an agreed level of security, and you weren't trying to compete on the basis of that. But you didn't want to get into the process where you were telling an airport or an airline how to respond to every security incident. And the challenge for the new Critical Infrastructure Act is exactly that. How do you provide a level of assurance to the community that those critical infrastructure services will be there without trying to over-regulate and lead industry to have compliance focus, which would misdirect their activities away from managing and responding to events when they occur, ensuring the continuation of their services, rather than focusing purely on complying with a regulatory requirement?
Well, it seems to me that a performance-based arrangement, which is what you're alluding to here, in terms of not prescriptive regulation, but performance-based, deemed to satisfy within an authorising environment that is appearing with these amendments to the legislation. One of the critical things in my thinking is this driving change in the way in which continuity management is conceived, understood and practiced, at least in the essential services area?
I would argue it isn't, Paul, because particularly the water sector, we've been doing this for well over 100 years. So we're already practiced at thinking about it in this way. Our leadership groups, our boards are already focused on risk. They're already focused on risk mitigations. What this might provide is a justification to looking at a wider series of risks and mitigations, particularly those to deal with those threats that are outside of what has been traditionally the concern of utilities. But I don't think it's going to change it dramatically. In fact, if anything, I think the problem, if there is a risk, it's that you'll start narrowing down on those specific issues, that the hazards that the federal government has deemed important through SOCI, and you might ignore others. I might give you a practical example of that, if that's okay.
Sure.
So we recently just prepared a plan to deal with the failure of a trunk sewer. So large pipe, deep underground. They don't fail very often, and in Australia they fail very, very rarely. When they do fail, however, the results are catastrophic. There was an example in the United States where on Christmas Eve they had a large trunk sewer that had been leaking for many, many years and had been liquefying the ground. And on Christmas Eve, about half a dozen houses disappeared into the hole. A sinkhole had just opened up. Mm. They discharged a massive volume of untreated sewage into the environment. It led to 18 months worth of disruption. Now, it is very unlikely that the federal government's critical infrastructure regulations is going to drive us to consider those sort of plans. What we should be doing is holistically looking at risk. Now, that's the intent of the legislation, but as always, the problem about into a piece of legislation is what is the regulator's approach to enforcing those regulations, and do they drive a compliance outcome rather than the risk mitigation outcome thereafter? And I think the jury's going to be still out on that.
One of the other elements of the SOCI Act is a register of critical infrastructure assets. Now, to my understanding, as a former corporate risk manager within state government agencies, this is the sort of thing that would logically be on a risk register, a corporate risk register, or what I used to call in the past a corporate threat register. Different focus. One of the elements, and looking back to the initial creation of the legislation that we're talking about, was foreign direct investment ownership of critical infrastructure in Australia. And an element of the amendments coming in last year focused on interest and control information, the ability of owners or part owners to control, and I'm quoting here, to control relevant assets, the extent of an entity ownership or control over the asset, and operational information flows relevant to the to the operation of that particular asset. So it seems to me a lot of this information is focused on a particular type of vulnerability within the critical infrastructure class, as in essential services, potable water and sewage. And we know historically one of the earliest known cases of actual intervention, criminal intervention in critical infrastructure was a sewage treatment plant in Maroochydore in Queensland some years ago, where a disgruntled ex-contractor had a backdoor, ICT contractor had a backdoor that was left when he was doing updates of certain systems, and started to work with SCADA systems, opening and closing gates and causing floods. So there is a definite vulnerability in the ICT control of embedded systems in essential service, but there seems to be a focus on still an extension of foreign direct investment and the potential for information to flow where it's not supposed to flow, and specific control issues or loss of control issues within the providers of the essential service. So this seems to be a focused threat source, impacting on a particular vulnerability that might exist within systems. But it all seems to be part of what would normally be in a standard corporate risk register. Is this just updating what the essential service providers already have, or is this something new?
It's a combination of things, Paul. So the first comment I'd make about the SOCI Act, both the 2018 version of it and the new one, and the ownership and control information you spoke about, at least as far as it applies to those four original sectors covered by the Act. So that's water, gas, electricity, ports, and that's them, was they had to provide ownership and control information about the asset. And the issue here was the definition of what an asset is. So for most people working in a utility, and most people out in the street, they'll think of an asset as a physical thing, a pump, a dam, an electricity substation, a power line, a piping network. That's not what the SOCI Act defines as an asset. It defines the whole organisation as the asset. So Icon Water is an asset. Sydney Water is an asset. The problem with that is when you're starting to use mixed language. If I'm talking to an engineer, they don't think of Icon Water as an asset. They think of Icon Water as an organisation. Mm-hmm. And in fact, so does the boards and ownership. We spend a lot of time explaining what an asset is. And therefore, when you're starting to construct corporate risk registers, they're focused on hazards and disruptions to what the organisation supplies, water, wastewater services in our case. So you start getting a bit of terminology creep. That's in both the current SOCI Act and the proposed amendments, which means that you're starting to look at, yes, you should have corporate risk registers that talk about the risks or hazards your business could potentially face and how you will mitigate them, at a corporate level. Now that's what the SOCI Act, as the 2018 version, is trying to create a regulatory framework for doing that. But the complexity is, of course, the moment you start defining terms in legal terms and move away from well understood risk and emergency management, business continuity terminology, you start getting confusion. Even today, I was in a workshop focused on developing the rules that will implement the SOCI positive security obligations. And even on this path with well-informed people, you still start to talk about, when we're talking about assets, they're not talking about pumps, computer systems, data, pipelines, dams. We're talking about organisations, the corporate risk register for Icon Water. And how well the federal government can regulate that is, again, a matter for debate. I think providing a framework that these are things that organisations should consider is a perfectly reasonable, useful approach. The danger will be, of course, what series of risks does the federal government really want to manage? And as we know, the biggest risk that governments face is a reputation risk. Mm-hmm. And some of the generation of the SOCI Act, particularly the concern around ownership and control of ports, the Darwin port being the obvious example, indicated that that the government might have been more concerned about reputation risk than they were about the operational risk of those assets and classes. But again, that's my personal opinion.
Mm. One of the issues that comes from your comment about terminology differences across the negotiating table, or at least the collegial discussion table of how these sorts of regulatory changes can be implemented and effectively applied, is that economists talk about things in different ways to engineers. Insurance people refer to perils rather than threats. Some people refer to risks rather than disturbances or loss events. So there seems to be a bit of a Tower of Babel phenomena happening across different industries in terms of the risk logic and the risk disciplines themselves. But in terms of looking at the organisation as an asset, is that, do you think, going to change the way in which corporate risk registers are written and managed and used within the essential services?
Fundamentally, I don't. It might lead to what in security academia would call the broadening and deepening of the concepts of security. So we're not just talking about physical threats, cyber threats, and security responses to those threats. We're now starting to combine what would be corporate risks and hazards that the organisation would face into a combined register, and that's a good thing. I, however, must admit I struggle myself with balancing conscious actors, criminals, terrorists, cyber criminals, hackers, who are a conscious actor looking to do harm, compared to a natural hazard, an earthquake, a fire, a flood. A terrorist is actually trying to do harm, and that's a really different approach when you try to mix them into an all hazards approach, and all hazards approaches are good for looking conceptually across organisations. It becomes very complicated though, because what your controls do, what effects do they try to achieve? Because you've got to start thinking in that way, which immediately takes you out of the strategic level and starts diving you very quickly into the tactical level of discussions. And you can get caught up in discussions around controls and control effectiveness, but at the same time, you're trying to look at a series of hazards across the organisation. It can also lead to misdirection of work. Now, we've been quite lucky in Icon Water. We've deliberately approached our emergency and business continuity management and our risk management arrangements with a deliberate tiered structure. So tier 1, whole of organisation risk registers, tier 1, whole of organisation emergency management plans, tier 1, whole of organisation business continuity plans that are designed to integrate together, whole of organisation strategic management plan, security management plans. But things will start to blur, particularly when you start blurring a control designed to deal with a conscious actor at the same time as the same control is trying to deal with a unconscious actor. So, for example, clearing a sight line down a fence line for a security purpose can also provide you a good bushfire hazard reduction purpose. That's great. But there is no way that a CCTV system is going to manage your control against an earthquake. It might help you manage the consequences,
Sure.
but they're very different approaches. The one thing you can't do with a natural hazard, you can't dissuade it, you can't disrupt it. In most cases, those events are going to occur. You might be able to mitigate the consequences, but that's not what you try to do through security controls. And I think that's where the SOCI Act, particularly with its focus on an all hazards approach, whilst a good and laudable aim, is going to get complicated. And when you put it into a regulatory and legislative focus, it's going to create significant complication.
One of the, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not fully in-depth understanding of the Act as you are, obviously professionally you have to be. The notion of intent and capability from a conventional human actor triggered event as compared to a natural hazard manifesting as a flood or a bushfire, there's no, the risk assessment approach as in likelihood and consequence of a disruption, where you might be looking at, you estimate a reasonable likelihood and we have a large consequence, and you can plan for events that may happen. When you have these natural hazards manifesting, you know they're happening. There's no likelihood phenomena necessarily in an acute or at least a specific response to such a disruption. Can you anticipate, is there an issue within the Act as you read it so far, and we don't know what further amendments may come down the line, but it's sometimes very difficult for black letter lawyers to write in looseness, and when I say looseness, I mean the ability to define the need to be able to anticipate future threat sources or hazards manifesting as loss. Is there a distance between the legislative requirements and the profession of continuity management as you apply it, where anticipation of future loss or disturbance seems to be not picked up in legislative change?
I guess it's the complexity, Paul, of if you're trying to draft legislation that has to have a level of being very specific, but also has to have very defined terms. And very naturally, they're creeping away from what are the well understood terms in our risk and emergency management standards. So you start getting terminology that in the legislation it means this, but for if you're complying with ISO 31000, it means this. You haven't had those kind of discussions with boards where they talk about hazard. We're actually talking about risks, and where they're talking about impacts, you're talking about consequences. You end up spending a lot of time talking around language as you described. You're trying to, because naturally a legislative drafter wants to use specific language that can be tied to specific meanings, or in some cases they're going to use terminology that will be defined through the courts as cases come before them. It's the difficulty, and I know from working in transport security before, how do you have a principles-based approach to risk management put into legislation that at the end of the day will have a prosecutor and a defender arguing about what that means. And it is going to be complicated. Now, I'd like to believe, and this then comes down to what's the regulatory philosophy that the Department of Home Affairs and other Commonwealth regulators will adopt. If they're going to be a principles-based cooperative regulator designed to try and improve outcomes, well, that's absolutely great and laudable. If, however, they want to adopt a punitive approach, and that relates to what is the government, the political side's tolerance for risk, and particularly reputational risk, you start driving on different you can have the potential of driving different outcomes. You can have the potential, and I think, not wishing to mix up risk terminology myself, but you have the risk of the unintended consequences of the legislation. I certainly think that the proposed amendments to the SOCI Act, as generally written, are good processes. Boards have to consider the material hazards facing their organisation, and whether the controls they put in place are effective to continue the operation of their businesses, and that's a good and laudable aim. But where it gets into problems is, what is the view of the regulator? How are those regulations going to be enforced? Not when we're cooperatively working together. That's always easy. It's when do you come under pressure that things become problematic. I can remember a situation when I was in transport security where an event occurred at one of our major airports. A person had bypassed explosive trace detection, tracing the ETD trace. Now that happened from time to time. That was managed as it's a potential issue, but most of the time the person bypasses ETD screening is either in a rush or they don't understand, or they don't speak, their English isn't good enough to understand what the screener wants, or it just happens to be a busy day or whatever it was. And they disappeared into the airport terminal and they were lost. Now that happened not all the time, but quite frequently in a lot of big international airports. It'd be not an unusual circumstance often. Unfortunately, the day that event occurred, the security manager was presenting to the airport's board, and the person's phone went off. The board's all interested to see what the security manager is now talking about, and then when the leadership of the board got focused on a reputation risk, we potentially breached the Aviation Security Act, Transport Security Act. It led to an unintentional consequence, which they wanted to evacuate the airport and create a massive disruption far and beyond the consequences of the one person evading ETD. And that's an example of what happens when you come under pressure, when things aren't going the way you expected, and when you've got a regulatory format that provides sanctions. There will be a temptation at times to use them to drive outcomes, and then you lose the trust and the shared understanding of how you manage these risks. And that's what I think there is some potential risk with the SOCI Act as it's being developed. Now, let's hope that the government remains proportional, that it recognises that sectors that have long been involved in security, electricity, telecommunications, international aviation and maritime transport, that those sectors are mature, and water. They're mature, they have good risk management arrangements in place, and rather than pushing to lift their security beyond what is reasonable and foreseeable, that you are allowed to say, okay, we've got this, we know where you guys are, and we can then focus our efforts on the gaps. My concern is that if you have a change in the security environment, the threat environment, if you will, you could have a disproportionate reaction, and then you can start pushing security and outcomes in directions that actually then lose track of what are much more likely, natural hazards, for example.
Sure.
Icon Water faced in January 2020 a major threat to our water supply by our catchments by a major bushfire going in and burning out the catchment. As you said, I wasn't going to be able to disrupt or dissuade or defer or argue with the bushfire. It was coming. We had to manage the consequences.
Yeah.
And that's what you want the organisation to focus on. What threats are likely to appear, not what's the regulatory mechanism that you have to comply with.
Yes, one of the issues in my understanding of how these things operate is that regulation often looks to things that have not occurred, future disruptions and disturbances. When the disturbance is about to occur, the likelihood phenomena, that the anticipation element of the legislation and the intent of the governance doesn't seem to work anymore, because you're dealing with an event that will have immediate and secondary and tertiary consequences. So the notion of regulation and law being about future events doesn't really occur. And sometimes I'm not sure whether regulation captures immediate events, as you've alluded to, as compared to future potential events that you're trying to limit their occurrence.
I can give you an example, Paul, if you're interested.
Sure.
So we have a piece of legislation that requires us to test our emergency plan on an annual basis. Perfectly reasonable. We schedule our exercises and tests on that 12-monthly basis, going, we've got a series of regulatory deadlines we have to meet. And then last year, we'd just come out of the bushfires, so we'd already activated our plan. We were actively running an incident management team to respond to the bushfire.
Yep.
But that wasn't a test, that was a real world event, and the legislation didn't foresee that was acceptable to be a test, an exercise, had to run an exercise. So the exercise was scheduled for late March 2020, and we all know what occurred in late March 2020, a pandemic turned up. And the regulator was in a difficult position. they've got a piece of legislation, they have the law that they have to ensure we comply with, that says you must conduct you must exercise your emergency management arrangements every 12 months. And we actually need an exemption for that because we've just come out of a bushfire, so we think we've shown and demonstrated that it does work, and that we are now in a pandemic, so we can't bring a bunch of people together.
Yeah.
And the regulator went, yeah, that's a problem. But they didn't have a regulatory solution for it other than a good regulatory philosophy that says, look, you've demonstrated that you're a good thing, but you're not compliant now and we'll work with you, which was great. But you can imagine a hard-edged regulator, black letter of the law regulator saying, you haven't met your regulatory requirement with it to do the exercise within 12 months. And those are those unintended consequences of what happens when you get into that regulatory framework as we were discussing. It moves the business away from good risk management arrangements, looking at, hey, we'd prepared for the pandemic. We were quite late. You know, as we saw during the bushfires, we saw the information coming out of China and other parts of the world. We got out the Commonwealth's pandemic plan, which was good. We developed a campaign plan based on some great advice that coming through some professional networks we're involved in. There's an organisation called the Australian Public Service Business Continuity Management Network. So we were able to share plans across organisations. We're able to develop a campaign plan for COVID. And then we got to March and you're suddenly going, we're into incident management mode, but it's not an emergency management. This is a business continuity event. We're looking at how do we keep supplying water and wastewater services to the ACT community during a pandemic, a pretty important outcome. And yet we didn't have a regulatory framework that allowed for that. And that's where you have those issues.
Yeah. So one of the take-home messages for me from what you just said is that agility in our legislative frameworks to allow a deemed to satisfy solution to be recognised, that an exercise will never be as informative as a real emergency incident command event, especially if it's protracted. So could be that there needs to be some feedback coming to government about deemed to satisfy elements in future amendments. Guy, I have one final question for you, and thank you for your comments with me today, is that when you have time to step back from your day-to-day stresses of being a continuity manager, what are the questions you ask yourself in the evenings when you sit on your deck overlooking a pleasant countryside in peaceful time? What are you asking yourself about? What are your thoughts currently about how things are in the world?
Other than my first thought, which is how good this glass of malt whiskey I'm drinking is, but that aids to reflective contemplation. I sit there and think, what is it we haven't got? What is it we're missing? What is that black swan event that we should have prepared for that either wasn't a priority, didn't meet a planned or a business priority? What's there that we haven't prepared for? And does my doctrine for business continuity, emergency management, do our risk processes allow us to be able to adapt to that event? And it's easy to describe black swan events as things that aren't predictable. But I just finished reading Neil Ferguson's book Doom, where he talks about the range of catastrophic events that could occur. Obviously, a man who knows how to write a topical book, but he writes it just as a pandemic is occurring. Oh. But what are those events that could occur? What risks haven't we thought about that we would be expected to manage when the event occurs? I was in our water sector trust information sharing group, and we were running over a year of unforeseen events. If you consider 2019, 2020, multi-state, 4-state catastrophic bushfires, there had been flood events, there'd been pandemics, there'd been power disruptions. All of that occurred, and you sit there thinking, what else? What else could happen? I guess that's what goes through my mind, and to think, how prepared are we? Because at the end of the day, you can't write a plan for every contingency. How trained and adaptable are our people? And in some ways, COVID gave us a really good response. I went to the Australian Command and Staff College in 2008, which was a fantastic year of learning and education. And it was the first time I'd ever been shown the idea that a pandemic, influenza pandemic in their case, was a major threat. I'd never thought about it, certainly never thought about it as a security issue. And then I graduated. I was lucky enough to get a job in transport security. And within 3 months, we were dealing with the H1N1 swine flu epidemic. And that's something I'd never thought about up until that point. And when they were going through it in staff colleges as an academic exercise, I must have, myself and a few of my colleagues sort of, yep, in 1918, that probably was going to be a problem, but not now with a modern, a modern health system, modern controls, modern pharmacological outcomes, etc. And yet there we were. Ironically, 10 years later, we're back again.
In a slightly more serious setting context as well.
Indeed, and yet it's interesting, though, and again, this probably leads to that thought. I think it's been well documented that those countries seem to be well prepared for influenza pandemics. The United States, the United Kingdom, arguably ourselves, and we've done a lot of work on influenza pandemics. Perhaps maybe we're caught out a little bit by an event that had a similar event had occurred in Asia not long beforehand, twice in the 2000s, and yet we've seemed a bit caught out by that.
Some say that you have to expect the unexpected, but unfortunately investing time and money in the unexpected is often not a popular thing to do within government. Exactly,
and that's why, again, I think we go back to what's the risk that governments most worry about? They worry most about reputation risk. And I think for those of us who work in emergency and business continuity and risk worlds, we have to where that's where the pressure will come, because we're going to be expected to have been prepared for it. Because the last thing a democratically elected government wants to do is be shown that its reputation isn't up to scratch.
Guy Richardson, Business Continuity Coordinator of Icon Water, thank you for your time today. It's been a great, certainly a great pleasure for me to talk to you, and I hope the listeners appreciate some of the nuances of what you've said. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Paul. Much appreciated. Thank you.